Good evening, everybody, and thanks for hanging around to listen to me. I know I'm the second last slot, so it's good to see at least some people in the audience, and hopefully I'll give you a presentation worth staying for. So my name's Leanne Halliday. I'm Territory Manager for Oceania for LRQA, and we provide assurance, certification and inspection services across all sectors, but specifically me talking to you today is around hydrogen. So 12 months ago, I stood on this stage at the first World Hydrogen Summit 2022, and I talked about the risks in the supply chain. The risks in the supply chain are exactly the same 12 months later. Some of them may have been escalated, and we're definitely moving forward. But my presentation today is more focused on how do we ensure compliance in that supply chain? How do we make sure that what we're producing and the equipment we're providing to the industry is safe and of a quality that we expect? When I'm talking about supply chain and when I'm talking about hydrogen as well, I'm not just talking about electrolyzers. I'm not just talking about how we produce the hydrogen, but the whole sphere, the whole ecosystem that's associated with hydrogen. So right from the energy production, the storage, the wind farms, the solar, however we're going to produce the electricity to produce the hydrogen, through ammonia, through methanol for export and transportation. And then also, when we produce the molecule, how are we going to commercialise that molecule? And how are we going to make sure that that is compliant and there's the governance within that commercialisation? I've seen many slides like this over the last couple of days. But basically, all I'm saying here is that there is a lot happening in the hydrogen space. Every country has its own targets towards net zero by 2030, 2050, whatever we're working towards. And also, I've got on this slide 63 countries, but actually, as of today, 120 countries have hydrogen strategies. That means that although we might have standards and regulations in some countries, in some jurisdictions for some equipment, we certainly don't have them spanning the whole ecosystem and everywhere that we will be producing hydrogen. One of the examples I gave here, the graph, is the growth that we're seeing in the composite pressure vessel market. So traditionally, LRQA has spent a lot of time compliance of pressure vessels, whether that's for the European market, Australian market, wherever it is in the world. But composite vessels are one of the real growth areas, not just for vehicles, but also for doing production of electrolyzers, production of hydrogen. So how does that fit into the whole compliance space? And this graph is showing a 20% year-on-year increase in the number of composite vessels required to meet the hydrogen demand. So I said that 12 months ago, I spoke about the supply chain and spoke about the challenges, and it's exactly the same. So we're working in a very growing supply chain. The equipment's not new, right? Electrolyzers, pressure vessels, the whole balance of plant associated with hydrogen have been around for many years. But the scale in which we need to meet this supply chain, and also the innovations we need to make the electrolyzer sector scalable, and to a size that we need to be able to make a difference from an energy transition point of view, is different. Whenever you get a stretched supply chain, you also have to put more focus on quality, more focus on compliance, making sure that you get what you want, when you want it, but also of the quality that you want it. There's also, in a long lead time supply chain, I can't think of the word, but there's a potential for people to skip the compliance steps, get things out quickly, and therefore that's an added focus that we need. The one thing that I do want to focus on this slide is competency. Lots of people entering this industry, lots of people I've spoke to over the last 2 days, people entering the industry from oil and gas, people entering the industry from the power sector, people entering the industry from other utilities. Hydrogen is different to natural gas. Hydrogen is different to LNG and other cryogenics, and particularly at the scale. Absolutely, competencies are transferable, but you have to go into the industry with your eyes wide open, stay curious, and understand the difference that hydrogen brings. And that we're working with regulators globally to also understand that difference. How do we make the standards practical for this industry? And how do we make the compliance also lead us to a social license to operate? I'm not sure I've seen that mentioned enough during this 2-day conference, but hydrogen does not have the best reputation, particularly when we're talking to communities where we'll be doing fuel for cars, etc., and also large-scale hydrogen projects. So we have to make sure that we have the right governance in place through compliance, through quality, through safety, to make sure that we have got that social licence to operate. Also, from a company's point of view, some of the standards that we're talking about aren't new. Standards for hydrogen have been around for a lot of years. Some of the ISO standards, 22734, for example, for electrolyzers, has been around for many years. But people entering the hydrogen industry don't necessarily have the level of detail that they would need or that they would have in their old industries, or don't necessarily have the trust in them standards to be able to implement them. So that's something else that we're seeing. Everybody in the industry is thirsty for information. Everybody wants to know how they can be compliant. So what are some of the questions that we get asked very regularly? So what is the regulatory requirements of a country that I want to export to? What is the regulatory requirements of a country that I want to do a project in? And even if you look at like somewhere like Australia, it's not just the country, but it's the particular state. So if I'm exporting to Western Australia, how is that different to Victoria, etc.? How do I provide compliance of my equipment? I've got this fantastic piece of equipment that I want to sell into the industry, but I've never used it. I haven't got an experience list. The procurers, the supply chain don't have trust in my equipment. How do I prove that my equipment is compliant? How do I prove that my equipment is of the right quality? This is a really interesting one. How does the use of hydrogen affect the use of existing standards? And I go back to pressure vessels. So PED, ASME, AS1210 are all absolutely applicable to hydrogen, okay? But hydrogen, like I mentioned earlier, is a different fluid. So we can absolutely certify hydrogen equipment to them particular standards, but we need to understand the complexity of hydrogen and how that is affecting the standard and how that affects how we certify particular parts. If I get one thing across in this presentation, it's this purple box at the bottom. Compliance should add value. Compliance is about making sure we have a social license to operate, making sure that things are safe, products are safe, projects are safe, and projects are of a quality that are going to last. It's not a stopper, and it's not a reason to slow the market. I hear so many people whinging that there isn't a regulation in place, there isn't a standard in place, and that's why their projects aren't going ahead. If you work with a company like LRQA or other third-party inspection agencies, we can really interrogate the standards. We can go back to engineering first principles. We can help you to put a roadmap in place, also looking at from a global perspective, where is the best practice if there's not a particular regulatory regime or standard for your particular export country, and how we can get you that roadmap to market. And then work with regulators to really educate them as well about what is right for that particular jurisdiction. The two diagrams on here, the graph and the map, is just showing that the different sphere that hydrogen is working in. We all know where oil and gas is produced, right? It's produced where the dead dinosaurs are, or where the oil and gas is in the world. So there's been hubs of oil and gas that have got a supply chain associated with them. Hydrogen has very different needs, right? So hydrogen, you need sun, you need water, you need wind, for example, if we're taking them two energy sources, but you also need a market. And therefore, we're seeing hydrogen industry developing in places that never necessarily had a strong regulatory regime or a strong industry, and therefore we have to work, particularly in them developing places, to make sure that they do take best practices and move them into the hydrogen sector. And also, like I said earlier on, hydrogen standards have been around for many years, but very much associated with the traditional production and use of hydrogen in the chemical and fertiliser space, not necessarily in the places where we're going to be using hydrogen in the future. So if we look at this map, and if this is the reality, and I'm seeing that when I'm looking at the stands around the place, if we're looking by 2050, a much more mix in electricity use for your homes, in cars, in vehicles, in aviation, we need to look and make sure standards are mature enough to be able to look at all of these different places. So what am I saying? Why are people coming to us? And how can we help you through this minefield of compliance and regulation? And I would say the key is early engagement and planning. So making sure that you understand what the gaps are. And that could be gaps in your particular design or your particular manufacture, but also gaps in the regulatory environment or the standards environment that you're working in, and putting roadmaps in place to be able to reduce them gaps. So we're finding a lot that traditionally where we would do design review for regulatory compliance, we're now doing design review for gap analysis. So it's not necessarily needed, but it's a need for the end user or for the manufacturer to show trust in their product or the product that they're purchasing. Take a global view. There is some very good standards. China, for example, have a lot of hydrogen standards. Look at where best practice is and see how that can apply to your particular need. Australia, for example, I'm part of a working group for the Australian Production, Handling and Storage Standards Committee. And what they're doing is looking at ISO standards, looking at IEC standards and tailoring them to Australia use rather than creating their own. How can we make the use of what's already out there? By doing this road mapping, understanding the delays, not letting the lack or the immaturity of regulation be a showstopper, then you avoid delays, you make this industry a reality, particularly in places where it's needed and places that haven't necessarily had an industry previously. I just quickly put this slide up. I talked about using existing standards in a hydrogen context. So what's different about hydrogen? Well, essentially, hydrogen is a very small molecule, and that means it's a leaky little blighter, right? It doesn't even have to go through a crack in order to have an escape. For some materials, it can actually just absorb into the lattices of the material and cause issues, such as hydrogen embrittlement. So a lot of what we've seen in the traditional standards, like PED, like ASME, is it's all about material selection. Is material selection correct? Welding. Quality of welding has to be looked at, the quality of the welding procedures and qualification of the people doing it, and also hardness testing. So it's not a lot different, but just looking at the uniqueness of hydrogen as a fluid and how that affects the particular standard and where you need to focus your effort. So just two examples that I wanted to give. I'm sorry, I have no idea. Oh, I've just seen my time. I have 2 minutes left. That's okay. I can continue to talk. What we're seeing is the industry actually being proactive. So where there is a lack of standards or regulations, them looking to see how they can build trust in their particular equipment. And one example is the electrolyzer standard, ISO 22734. That doesn't have a certification requirement associated with it, but we are seeing industry coming to us and asking us to do a design review, audit, inspections against that standard and issuing certificates of statement of facts to show that it's compliant in order to give them a route to market and build trust with all of these people who have not worked in this industry prior and need to build trust in the industry. The other thing is technology qualification or approval in principle. How do we help companies get a route to market in this immature environment? And taking a practical approach, looking at high-level risks, looking at standards that have applied, looking at design, and making sure that we, as a third party, can provide them with a statement that says that particular equipment is approved in principle to be used in a hydrogen context. And finally, looking wider, not just looking at one application. So this is an electrolyzer certification that we did, and the client originally came to us and said, I want to sell my electrolyzer into Europe. That's great. We could do that. We could do the design review. We could do compliance to the Europe. But then we also had conversations with them and realized that they were being just looking at one avenue. They actually, if we spent time with them, we could certify that electrolyzer for global use. So we certified it for use in Australia, in China, and also to ISO 22734, which was applicable in places where they didn't necessarily have a standard that applied. That's just a rundown of our approval in principle process, which will be available on the slides. So if you take nothing away, I would say don't let the lack of regulations or standards be a showstopper. Work with companies to understand what are the key risks and how we can help you navigate them risks by taking a global overview and implementing best practice and looking at the true risks of the particular nature and end use of your product rather than just looking at a whole overview. It's the end of the conference, but we were at E19 and we will be there for about the next 20 minutes, half an hour, if you want to come and visit us. Or I look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you.